Henry pushed open the heavy wooden door of his house, and it creaked with the usual noise, as if complaining of fatigue after a long day. The air inside was filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint scent of lavender. Sarah always placed candles with the scent on the windowsill in the living room. He dropped his briefcase by the door, not caring that the papers inside might get wrinkled, and pulled off the tie that had been strangling him all day, like a symbol of corporate captivity. Work at the office had been especially grueling today. Endless reports, calls from clients who demanded the impossible, and a boss whose mood changed faster than the weather outside. Henry dreamed of silence, a glass of red wine, and simply falling into the soft embrace of the sofa. But something in the air told him that the evening would not be as calm as he had hoped. Sarah stood at the kitchen island, her slender fingers wrapped around the handle of a ceramic mug. She wore a simple gray sweater that had once been Henry's favorite, but now seemed too big for her slight frame. Her blonde hair, usually pulled back neatly into a bun, was down today, a few strands falling over her face, obscuring her eyes. She didn't look up when Henry entered, which was unusual. Sarah always greeted him with a smile, even if the day had been rough. Instead, she was silent, and the silence was thick, almost tangible, like the fog that settled over the city in the early morning. "Hey," Henry said, trying to sound casual, though there was a vague sense of unease brewing in his chest. He walked over to the refrigerator, opened the door, and pulled out a bottle of water, more to keep his hands occupied than out of thirst. "How was your day?" Sarah slowly raised her head, and her gaze, sharp as a blade, pierced him. Henry froze, feeling the cold from the bottle in his hands spreading throughout his body. Her eyes, usually warm as the summer sky, were now cold, almost alien. She set the mug down on the table with a sound that made Henry involuntarily flinch. "We need to talk," she said quietly, but every word fell like a stone into a bottomless well, echoing in his head. Henry felt his heart skip a beat. The phrase, so simple and banal, sounded like a death sentence on her lips. He had known Sarah for 10 years, 7 of them married, and in all that time she had never said the words in such a tone. Usually, "we need to talk" meant discussing bills, weekend plans, or small household matters. But now there was no hint of ordinariness in her voice. It was the voice of someone holding something fragile and dangerous in her hands, something that could shatter at the slightest careless movement. "Okay," he replied, trying to remain calm, although everything inside him was clenching with anticipation. He put the bottle on the table and sat down opposite her, trying to catch her eye. "What happened?" Sarah was silent, as if gathering her strength. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the hem of her sweater, and Henry noticed that her nails, usually neatly trimmed, were bitten down to the base. This was another alarming signal. Sarah never allowed herself such trifles. She was always collected, almost perfect. He waited for her to speak, but the silence became heavier and heavier, and at some point Henry felt that it was strangling him, like the very tie he had thrown off at the entrance. "I found something," she said finally, her voice shaking as if she were teetering on the edge of a precipice. "In your office." Henry frowned, trying to understand what she was talking about. His office was his private space, a place where he kept his books, old photographs, and papers he never showed even to Sarah. It wasn't a secret, just a place where he could be alone. But now, judging by her tone, it was more than just a place to think. "What do you mean?" he asked, feeling his voice grow quieter, as if afraid to scare away the truth that was about to emerge. Sarah reached into her bag on the chair next to her and pulled out a small envelope. It was old, yellowed, with worn edges, as if it had been opened and closed many times. Henry felt his heart clench as he recognized the envelope. He had not seen it for many years, but memory, like a faithful dog, came back to life, bringing with it the smell of the past, bitter and heavy. "It was hidden behind your books," Sarah said, her voice firmer now, but still trembling with pain. "I wasn't looking for anything. I was just cleaning, but I found it, and I want to know why you never told me about it." Henry looked at the envelope lying between them on the table as if it were a ticking bomb. He knew what was inside. He knew every word, every line, written in the neat handwriting that had once been more precious to him than anything else in the world. But how could he explain it to Sarah? How could he tell her what he had tried to forget, to bury under the layers of everyday life, work, and their happiness together? "Sarah," he began, but his voice broke. He cleared his throat, trying to control himself. "It was a long time ago. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything." Her voice grew louder, and there was a bitterness in it that cut like a knife. "Henry, I read those letters, every word, and you're telling me it doesn't mean anything." Henry closed his eyes, feeling the world crumble around him. The letters, of course she had read them. He should have destroyed them years ago, but every time he picked them up, something inside him stopped. They were part of his past, part of himself, and throwing them away would be like cutting off a piece of his soul. "That was before you," he said finally, opening his eyes and meeting her gaze. "Before us. I was a different person then." "But you kept them," Sarah said, her voice breaking as if she were holding back tears. "You kept them all these years, Henry. Why? If it was so long ago, if it meant nothing, why didn't you get rid of them?" He was silent because he didn't know the answer. Or maybe he knew, but was afraid to say it. The letters were written by Alice, his first love, the woman who broke his heart and left a hole in it that never healed. Alice was a whirlwind, a chaos that burst into his life and turned everything upside down. She was the one who made him laugh until he cried, and then cry in pain. And even though he met Sarah, fell in love with her, built a life with her, Alice remained a shadow that always followed him, hiding in the corners of his memory. "I don't know," he said finally, and it was true. "I just couldn't throw them away." Sarah looked at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes that Henry felt like a traitor. He wanted to go to her, hug her, tell her that everything would be okay, but something told him that simple words would not help anymore. This envelope, these letters became a crack in their marriage, and he did not know how to repair it. "I don't know how to trust you anymore," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I knew you, Henry. I thought we had no secrets, but now I see that I was wrong." Henry felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, to explain, to justify himself, but the words stuck like stones in his throat. He looked at Sarah, at her pale face, at her trembling hands, and he knew that this was only the beginning. Something had changed in that moment, something had broken, and he wasn't sure if he could fix it. "Sarah, I love you," he said at last, and it was true, but even that truth seemed weak, insufficient. "These letters, they don't change anything. They're the past. You're my present, my future." She shook her head, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail. "I want to believe you, Henry, but I don't know how." The silence filled the kitchen again, and this time it was unbearable. Henry looked at the envelope on the table and felt his life, so familiar and secure, begin to crumble. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The phrase, "we need to talk," was the beginning of the end. The end of what their marriage, their trust, their happiness. He didn't know, but he felt that this evening would change everything. Sarah stood up, picked up her mug, and silently left the kitchen. Henry remained sitting, looking at the envelope, which now seemed to him not just a piece of paper, but a symbol of all his mistakes, all his fears. He knew he had to do something, say something, but at that moment he felt helpless, like a child lost in the dark. It was starting to rain outside, and the drops were tapping on the glass, as if reminding him that time was running out. Henry closed his eyes and tried to remember when everything had gone wrong. But his memory was silent, and only Alice's voice, distant and ghostly, sounded somewhere on the edge of his consciousness, repeating the words from those very letters that he could never forget. The rain outside continued to fall, its monotonous tapping on the windowsill becoming the soundtrack to their silence. Henry remained seated at the kitchen table, staring at Sarah's empty mug, which still sat before him like a silent reproach. Her words, "I don't know how to trust you anymore," echoed in his head, intertwined with the noise of the rain. He felt as if he were caught in the eye of a storm, unsure of where to swim or how to escape. The envelope with the letters lay untouched, but its presence was almost tangible, as if it radiated a chill that penetrated his very bones. Henry knew he should go after Sarah, try to explain, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. Instead, his thoughts wandered back to where his life with Sarah had still been full of light, and the shadows that now threatened everything were just faint outlines on the horizon. Their story began 10 years ago, in a small cafe on a street corner where the autumn wind blew fallen leaves across the sidewalk. Henry was a young analyst then, newly promoted but still unsure of himself. Sarah walked into the cafe with a friend, her laugh ringing like a bell, and Henry, sitting at the next table with a cold espresso, couldn't take his eyes off her. Her blonde hair shone gold in the dim light of the lamps, and there was an easy grace in her movements that made her look like a dancing shadow. He plucked up the courage to speak to her, and to his surprise, she responded with a smile that melted his awkwardness. They talked until the cafe closed, and then wandered the night streets for a long time, unaware of the cold. It was one of those rare moments when life seems perfect, like a scene from an old movie, where everything just works out. Their romance developed rapidly. 6 months later, Henry proposed, kneeling in the park under a blossoming cherry tree, and Sarah, laughing and crying at the same time, said yes. They were young, full of hope, and confident that their love could survive anything. The wedding was modest, but warm friends, laughter, toasts to their future. Henry remembered how Sarah looked that day. Her dress, simple but elegant, emphasized her fragility, and her eyes shone with faith that they could build something beautiful together. He believed it himself then. The first years of their marriage were like a honeymoon that never seemed to end. They rented a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town, where the wallpaper in the living room was peeling from dampness and the tap in the bathroom was constantly leaking. But these little things didn't bother them. They spent their evenings planning the future, the trips they would take, the house they would buy, the children they would have. Henry loved the way Sarah would light up when she talked about her dreams opening a small bakery where she would make pies using her grandmother's recipes, or going to Italy for a year to learn how to make real pasta. He promised her that all this would happen, that he would do everything to make her dreams come true. But life, as it often does, began to make its own adjustments. Henry got another promotion, but with it came long hours at the office, endless deadlines, and the stress that it brought home like an uninvited guest. Sarah, a freelance graphic designer, was often alone, and her dreams of a bakery or Italy were gradually pushed into the background. She never complained, but Henry noticed how her smiles became less frequent, how her eyes, once sparkling with enthusiasm, began to dull. He told himself that it was temporary, that he was working for their future, but with each passing month, the distance between them grew, although it was almost imperceptible. The daily grind began to pile up like dust in the corners. Bills that needed paying, car repairs that were put off because there wasn't enough money, petty squabbles over who forgot to buy milk or whose turn it was to do the dishes. Henry tried to be a good husband, but his energy was drained by his work, and at home he was often a shadow of his former self, tired, irritable, withdrawn. Sarah, for her part, tried to keep their home warm, but her efforts sometimes seemed one-sided. She cooked dinners, lit candles, tried to drag Henry out for walks, but increasingly he would respond, "I'm too tired, maybe another time." There had been a moment about 3 years ago that Henry now remembered with a pang. It had been their 6th wedding anniversary. Sarah had planned a romantic evening. She had decorated the living room with fairy lights, cooked his favorite dish, mushroom lasagna, and even brought out the bottle of wine they had been saving for a special occasion. But Henry had been late at work, caught up in another project crunch, and had returned home after midnight. He had found Sarah asleep on the couch, still wearing the dress she had worn especially for him. The lasagna had gone cold, the wine had remained unopened, and the fairy lights twinkled in the empty room like stars that had lost their meaning. He had apologized then, promising to make it up to her, but Sarah had only nodded, and there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before, disappointment mixed with fatigue. She hadn't made a scene, she hadn't shouted, but her silence had been louder than any words. From then on, such moments began to repeat themselves. Not quarrels, not scandals, but silence, which became more and more common. Henry noticed how Sarah sometimes closed in on herself, how she looked out the window for a long time, as if looking for answers in the clouds. He tried to talk to her, asked if everything was okay, but she answered briefly, "Everything is fine." And he believed or wanted to believe. He did not want to see that their marriage, so strong at first glance, began to crack like old porcelain. But there were bright moments, too, that kept them together. Summer trips to the lake, swimming until sunset, laughing and drinking cheap wine straight from the bottle. Evenings watching old movies, cuddled under a blanket. Moments when Sarah would suddenly start dancing in the kitchen to some silly song, and Henry couldn't help but join in, even when he felt ridiculous. These moments were like beacons in the fog, reminding him why he loved her, why he had chosen her. But even these beacons couldn't illuminate everything that lurked in the shadows of their marriage. Now, sitting at the kitchen table, Henry realized that the letters from Alice that Sarah had found were more than just a reminder of the past. They were a catalyst that had brought to the surface everything he and Sarah had avoided discussing for so long. He knew that Sarah wasn't just hurt, she felt betrayed, and not just by the letters, but by all the times he hadn't been there, even when he was there. He remembered her asking him one day, "Are you happy, Henry?" It had been a year ago, late at night, as they lay in bed. He had answered, "Of course," without thinking, because it was easier. But now he realized that the question had been a cry for help that he had ignored. Henry stood up, feeling fatigue and fear merge into one heavy feeling that was weighing him down. He went into the bedroom, where Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the floor. Her shoulders were slumped, and she looked so fragile that Henry wanted to put his arm around her, but he stopped at the door, not daring to intrude on her space. "Sarah," he began, but she raised her hand, stopping him. "Not now," she said quietly. "I'm not ready to talk. I need time." Henry nodded, even though everything inside him screamed to explain, to justify himself, to put everything back in its place. But he knew that his words now would only make things worse. He turned and walked out of the room, feeling the shadows of their marriage growing thicker, obscuring the light that had once united them. The rain outside grew heavier, and Henry stood at the living room window, watching the drops trickle down the glass like tears he couldn't shed. He knew this was just the beginning, that there would be more difficult conversations, more pain ahead. But deep down, he still hoped that they could find their way back to a time when their love was stronger than any shadow. The night stretched on forever, like a web of shadows and unspoken words wrapped around their home, where every corner now seemed filled with the ghosts of the past, and the air was thick with unspoken emotions that hovered around them like invisible moths, beating against a lamp glass, searching for a light that was no longer there. Henry lay awake on the couch in the living room, staring at the ceiling where the cracks of time reminded him of the cracks in their marriage, and every breath was a labored effort, as if his chest was being squeezed by an invisible hand of fate, whispering that everything could have been different if only he had noticed earlier the little signals Sarah sent him through the daily grind. But he was too caught up in his world of reports and deadlines to hear her quiet call. The rain outside had died down, leaving behind only a few drops pattering on the eaves, a reminder that time was not standing still, and the morning would inevitably come, bringing with it new challenges that he had been so afraid of, because deep down he knew that this morning could be a turning point, after which nothing would be the same, and their life, so familiar and comfortable in its predictability, was in danger of shattering into pieces, like a crystal vase falling from a shelf during an earthquake of emotions. As the first rays of dawn broke through the curtains, painting the room in a soft golden light, Henry heard footsteps on the stairs light, hesitant, as if Sarah was hesitating whether she should go down or stay in her room, where the walls could protect her from the pain that she carried in her heart like a heavy burden, invisible to prying eyes, but tearing her soul apart. She entered the living room. Her silhouette in the doorway seemed ephemeral, like a vision from a dream, and Henry raised himself on his elbow, feeling his heart beat faster in anticipation of something inevitable, but at the same time terrible, because in her eyes, usually so clear and full of warmth, a storm was splashing, where love, despair, and something else were mixed, which he could not name, but which made him shrink inside, as if anticipating a blow that was about to fall. Sarah stood at the window, looking out at the street where the morning dew glittered on the leaves of the trees, and her shoulders shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the inner struggle that had been raging inside her all night, as she went over in her mind the memories of their life together, of those moments of happiness that now seemed like distant islands in an ocean of disappointment, and of the letters, those damned letters that had opened Pandora's box, releasing the demons of doubt and jealousy that she had tried so hard to keep inside. "Henry," she said at last, and her voice was hoarse, as if from tears she was crying into the pillow so he wouldn't hear, but there was such tenderness in it, mixed with despair, that he felt his own eyes grow moist, because it was not just a name, but a cry from the heart, addressed to the man she loved despite everything that had happened, and this confession hung in the air like an invisible thread connecting their hearts even in this moment of rupture. "I love you." These words hit him like a wave, washing away a sand castle of illusions, and for a moment Henry froze, not believing his ears, because after yesterday's conversation, after the pain in her eyes, he expected anything reproaches, tears, even leaving, but not this sudden confession, which sounded so sincere, but with a note of despair, as if she was saying it for the last time, clinging to the remnants of their love, like a drowning man to a straw in a stormy sea of emotions. He got up from the couch, came closer to her, feeling his arms trembling with the desire to hug her, to hold her close and never let go, because in that moment he saw a chance fragile as a butterfly's wings, but a real chance to bring warmth back into their relationship, to rekindle the extinguished fire that once burned so brightly that it illuminated their whole life. And he thought that perhaps this was the beginning of reconciliation, the moment when they could talk for real, lay all the cards on the table, and build a bridge across the chasm that had opened up between them. But deep down, where instincts and premonitions lurked, he sensed a catch something in her tone, in the way she said the words, not with joy, but with sadness, as if saying goodbye, made him wary, as if there was something more hidden behind this confession, some secret that she had not yet revealed. And this sense of a catch pricked him like a needle, reminding him that nothing in their life would ever be simple again. "Sarah," he said, taking her hand, and her fingers were cold as ice, but she didn't pull away, she just squeezed his palm, as if seeking support in this touch that had once been so natural for them, and now seemed like an act of courage, breaking through the wall of alienation built from silence and omissions. "I love you too, more than anything in the world. Let's talk, let's fix everything." She turned to him, tears glinting in her eyes, which she quickly brushed away, not wanting to show weakness, but Henry saw his own pain reflected in them, and it brought them closer than they had been in months, because in this moment they were vulnerable, naked, and that vulnerability could be the basis for a new beginning, if only they could find the strength to weather the storm together. But the desperation in her voice was not gone. It hung around her like smoke from a dying fire, and Henry felt his heart tighten with the premonition that this confession would be followed by something that would change everything, perhaps forever, and he imagined their lives unfolding before him like an old film reel, with frames of happiness and sorrow intertwined in a strange pattern, where every decision had led to this moment, to this conversation that could save or destroy their marriage. Sarah let go of his hand and walked over to the sofa, sitting on the edge as if she had no strength left, and Henry followed her, sitting next to her, but not too close, respecting the space she had unwittingly created between them, like an invisible boundary that to cross was to risk everything. She was silent for a moment, collecting her thoughts, and in that pause Henry heard the ticking of the clock on the wall, steady, inexorable, a reminder that time was running out and every moment of delay could be a loss, but he did not rush her, knowing that the words that were about to be spoken would change their reality, and he wanted to be prepared, although deep down he knew that it was impossible to prepare for such a thing. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm, as if she had been rehearsing this speech all night, sorting through the words like beads on a rosary, looking for the ones that would convey the depth of her feelings without hurting too much. "I love you, Henry," she said again, and this time there was more desperation in her words, as if she were clinging to this love like a life-preserver in a stormy ocean, where the waves of doubt and pain threatened to swallow her whole. And Henry felt his own love for her flare up with new strength, but it was mixed with fear because he saw her struggling with herself, and this struggle frightened him more than any letters from the past. But this love, it's suffocating me. I feel trapped, where each day repeats itself, like a time loop, and I see no way out except to tell the truth. Henry froze, his breathing becoming ragged as the word truth hung in the air like the sword of Damocles, ready to fall and sever their bond. And he suddenly realized that the trap he had been sensing was not just an intuition, but a reality that was about to manifest itself. And his mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she had found something else in his office, or she had secrets of her own, or worst of all, she had met someone else who gave her the warmth he had failed to provide in recent years. But instead of asking directly, he took her hand again, squeezing his fingers as if it could keep her from saying the words he was afraid to hear. And in that moment, he remembered their first meeting, that autumn day in the cafe, when her laughter was like music and her eyes shone, promising eternal happiness. And he thought how far they had come from that moment, how life, with its routine and challenges, had turned their fairy tale into a drama full of omissions and hidden grievances. "What truth, Sarah?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, and he felt sweat break out on his forehead because the air in the room had suddenly become heavy, like before a thunderstorm, and he knew that after her answer the world would change, perhaps forever. She looked at him, and there was such a mixture of love and sadness in her eyes that Henry wanted to scream to stop time, to go back and correct all the mistakes, but time was inexorable, and the words were already rushing out, like a river breaking through a dam. I met someone," she said, and the words hit him like lightning, illuminating the dark landscape of his soul, where jealousy and pain had mixed into a swirl of emotions he could barely control. But she hastened to add, seeing his face go pale, "No, not like you think. This isn't an affair. This is a friend. Someone who listens to me when you can't. Someone who reminds me of who I used to be before our lives became so predictable." Henry felt relief mixed with a new wave of pain, because this wasn't cheating in the classic sense, but it was a betrayal of trust, an admission that he had failed to be what she needed, and that cut deeper than any physical betrayal because it went to the core of their relationship, the foundation on which they had built their marriage. He wanted to ask who this man was, how they had met, but instead he just nodded, trying to process her words, and images came into his head, Sarah laughing with someone else, sharing thoughts that had once been only for him, and the vision was like a knife in the heart, but at the same time he saw it as an opportunity, because if this wasn't an affair, then maybe they could still be saved if he changed, if he became the listener, the partner he had been in the beginning. "Tell me about him," he said, surprised by his calmness, but inside a storm was raging, where jealousy fought with love, and he thought that perhaps this confession was the catalyst that would make him fight for them, like never before. Sarah sighed, and her story flowed like a stream, full of details that made her words alive and painful. She met him in a cafe where she worked on design. He was an artist, with crazy ideas and a passion for life that reminded her of her own dreams, forgotten under a layer of everyday life, and they talked for hours about art, about traveling, about what makes life bright, and in these conversations she felt alive, not just a wife and housewife, but a woman with her own desires and ambitions. Henry listened, and every word was a sting, but he didn't interrupt, because he knew that this was her truth, and to ignore it was to lose everything. When she finished, there was silence in the room, broken only by their breathing, and he suddenly realized that this was the moment of truth, when he could either push her away or draw her closer, and he chose the latter, holding her, feeling her body tense but gradually relaxing in his arms. And in that moment he whispered, "We can change this. I can change. Let's try again." But deep down he still felt a catch, because her despair had not completely gone away, and he wondered if it was too late, if she had already gone too far in her thoughts, and the doubt gnawed at him like a worm gnawing at a tree from the inside. But he pushed it aside, focusing on the moment, on her warmth beside him, on the hope that flickered like a distant star in the night sky, promising that the morning would bring not only pain, but also the possibility of healing. They sat there for a long time, holding each other, and Henry felt time slow down, giving them a break from the emotional storm. But he knew it was only a pause, that there were more conversations to come, more confessions, and perhaps even bigger changes, like traveling together or going to therapy to sort out the hurts they had built up, like archaeologists digging through ancient ruins, looking for treasures beneath the dust of centuries. Sarah pulled away first, wiping away tears, her smile weak but genuine, and Henry thought that maybe this was a beginning and not an end, that their love, despite the despair, was still strong, and they could rebuild their marriage with new elements, adventures they had put off, dreams they had forgotten, and honesty that would become the foundation for the future. But there was a catch. Why did she confess now, after finding the letters? Was it a response to jealousy, or had she really planned to leave but changed her mind at the last minute? These questions swirled around in his head like leaves in an autumn wind, and he decided to ask about it later, when the emotions had subsided. But for now he simply held her hand, feeling the beat of her pulse synchronized with his own, a reminder that they were still together despite the shadows that surrounded them. The morning was slowly coming into its own. The sun was rising higher, filling the room with a light that seemed a symbol of hope, and Henry offered to make breakfast, a simple gesture but full of meaning, because in recent years he rarely did it, immersed in his own affairs, and Sarah agreed, her eyes lit up with a faint glint, as if remembering the times when they cooked together, laughing at ruined pancakes and kissing over the stove. They moved into the kitchen, and while Henry fried eggs and Sarah chopped vegetables, they talked about small things, the weather, their plans for the day, avoiding difficult topics. But this silent agreement was like a truce, giving them strength for the next fight. But in the middle of the conversation, Sarah suddenly stopped, the knife still in her hand, and she looked at him with such intensity that Henry felt goosebumps on his skin. "Henry," she said, and her voice wavered again, "I love you, but I'm afraid it might not be enough. What if we've changed too much?" That was the catch he felt, the fear that their love, though strong, might not be able to bear the weight of their problems, and Henry put down the frying pan and went to her, putting his arm around her shoulders and whispering words of comfort, but his mind was already swarming with plans. Maybe they should go away for the weekend, to that lake where they had been happy, or see a therapist, or even start a new hobby together, to add fantasy to their routine, to make life not monotonous but full of surprises, like in those stories where the heroes overcome obstacles and come out stronger. He imagined them driving down a winding road, the wind in their hair, the music on the radio, and Sarah smiling truly, without sadness, and this vision gave him the strength to believe that the catch was not the end, but a challenge that they could overcome together. Breakfast passed in relative peace, but Henry knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey, full of twists and turns and surprises, where their love would be tested to the limit, but he was ready to fight, because Sarah was his world, and without her, everything lost its meaning. As the day unfolded, Henry found himself fantasizing about what if their lives were like those in the book, where the characters discovered hidden talents or went on adventures that changed everything. Maybe Sarah could open her own bakery, and he would support her by leaving his job for something more creative, and the idea ignited a spark in him that he decided to discuss with her that evening, to add an element of surprise to their relationship, to make it less predictable and more alive and passionate. But for now, he simply looked at her, grateful for this confession despite his desperation, because it had opened a door for change, and he was determined to walk through it, holding her hand. Henry remembered an episode from their past that now seemed prophetic. It had been on their honeymoon in a small village on the coast, where the waves crashed against the rocks with uncontrollable force, and the air was filled with salt and freedom, and they had walked barefoot along the beach, collecting shells, each one a symbol of their love, unique, fragile, but beautiful. That evening, around the campfire, Sarah had told him of her childhood dream of becoming an explorer, of discovering lost cities and hidden treasures, and Henry had laughingly promised that they would do it together. But life had swirled them in a whirlwind of obligations, and the dream had faded into obscurity, like the sun below the horizon. Now, after her confession, he thought that perhaps the time had come to resurrect that fantasy, to organize a trip not just for a weekend, but for a real adventure into the jungle or ancient ruins, where they could get lost and find themselves again. And the idea had seized him, brightening the day despite the clouds of doubt. Sarah, in turn, seemed to be thinking about something of her own. Her movements became more thoughtful, and Henry noticed how she sometimes cast glances at him, full of tenderness, but with a touch of sadness, as if she were weighing her feelings on invisible scales, where love fought with the weariness of years. He wanted to ask her what she thought of their future, but decided to wait, to give her space, because to press would mean to risk pushing away, and he wanted to attract, to become a magnet for her heart, as in those days when their attraction was irresistible. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk in the park, where the air was crisp from the recent rain and the leaves crunched underfoot, creating a symphony of nature that was soothing to the soul. They walked in silence at first, but then they began to talk about small things, birds circling overhead, children playing on the lawn, and the simplicity of the conversation brought them back to a sense of normality. But Henry could feel the emotions simmering beneath the surface, ready to burst forth, and he carefully brought up the letters, explaining why he had kept them not out of love for Alice, but out of fear of losing a part of himself, that youth full of passion and mistakes that had shaped him into who he was. Sarah listened, nodding, and her answer was unexpected. She admitted that she had secrets to a diary where she wrote down her thoughts about their marriage, about the moments of loneliness when he was at work, and this admission brought them even closer together because it showed that both of them were imperfect, both hid parts of themselves, and now, by opening up, they could build something real, without masks. Henry's imagination ran wild. He imagined them burning the letters and the diary in a ritual fire, symbolizing purification, and starting a new chapter full of adventure, a skydive, or a dance lesson, or even moving to another city where everything would be fresh and exciting. The idea excited him, and he shared it with Sarah, and her eyes lit up with interest, although the despair was not yet completely gone, but it was a step forward, and Henry seized on it as hope. The day passed in such conversations, interspersed with moments of silence, and by evening they were tired, but it was a good tiredness from the emotional labor that was bringing them closer to healing. Lying in bed that night, Henry held Sarah, feeling her breath on his chest, and thought that the declaration of love, despite the catch, was a bridge over which they could cross to a better future, full of fantasy and variety, where monotony would give way to adventures of the soul and the heart. The sun was setting, painting the sky in crimson and gold that reflected off the windows of their home, as if trying to remind them that even in the darkest of times there was beauty. Henry stood at the sink, washing the dishes after a dinner that he and Sarah had shared in an unusual silence, not the oppressive kind that had been there before, but rather a cautious attempt to maintain the fragile truce they had reached that morning. Her declaration of love, mingled with despair, still sounded in his ears like a melody he couldn't quite place a song of hope or a requiem for their marriage. He tried to focus on the soap suds, the rhythmic sliding of the sponge across the plates, but his thoughts, like unruly birds, flew in different directions, returning to her words about a friend, about how someone else could give her what he, Henry, had missed in his pursuit of stability. And yet, despite the pain, he felt a spark of determination. He would not give in, would not let their love dissolve into routine and unsaid things. But in recent days, something new had begun to disturb him, like a barely perceptible rustle in the night that made him freeze, listening to the darkness. It had started with little things, so insignificant that he'd brushed them off at first, chalking them up to fatigue or paranoia from their recent conversation. The first sign had come a few days ago, when he'd noticed Sarah quickly turn off her phone when he'd walked into the room. She'd smiled too quickly and said something vague about a text from a colleague, but her fingers were fiddling nervously with the hem of her sleeve, and Henry had felt a twinge of suspicion, as if someone invisible were whispering in his ear. Something's wrong here. He hadn't asked, he didn't want to upset their delicate balance, but the moment had stuck in his mind like a splinter that began to hurt when pressed. Then there was another strange thing. Yesterday morning, when Sarah had gone to take a shower, her phone had been left on the kitchen counter, and the screen had suddenly lit up with a notification of a new message. Henry hadn't meant to peek. He'd never been one to snoop through other people's things, but his gaze had fallen on the sender's name, Matt. The name meant nothing to him, but something about the way Sarah had quickly grabbed her phone when she came back from the bathroom and immediately deleted the notification had made him tense up inside. She hadn't said a word, but her movements had been abrupt, almost panicked, and Henry felt a cold feeling welling up in his chest that he didn't want to call jealousy, but that burned like a hot coal all the same. This afternoon, when he had returned from work earlier than usual, Sarah had suddenly announced that she had to run out and run some errands. She hadn't said where, which was unusual. Sarah was always fond of sharing plans, even the most mundane ones, like going to the supermarket or meeting a friend for coffee. She left, leaving behind a faint scent of her perfume, which Henry always associated with their happy days, and the contrast between her usual warmth and her sudden reserve only increased his anxiety. He watched her go, her silhouette disappearing into the evening light, and the question swirled in his head: where was she going? And why didn't she want him to know? Henry dried his hands on a towel and stepped away from the sink, glancing at the kitchen table where the envelope with Alice's letters still lay. He had left it there, as if hoping its presence would be a reminder to be honest. But now he looked at it with a new feeling, as a symbol of how secrets could destroy even the strongest bonds. He began to wonder if Sarah was hiding more than just friendly conversations with an artist named Matt. His imagination, usually so mundane, suddenly ran wild, painting images that made him sick. Sarah laughing with someone else, her eyes shining the way they had for him at the beginning of their affair. Sarah moving on to another life where he, Henry, would be just a memory, as Alice had been for him. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts away, but they clung like thorns, and every little thing he noticed only strengthened his suspicions. For example, last night, while they were watching a movie, Sarah had gotten a call and immediately went into the other room, closing the door. He could hear her muffled voice, but he couldn't make out the words, and when she returned, her cheeks were slightly pink, as if she were trying to hide her excitement. She said it was her sister, but Henry knew how Sarah's voice sounded when she spoke to her sister light, with a hint of laughter. And now her tone was different, more reserved, almost businesslike. He didn't pry, but the episode added another crack to his confidence. Henry walked into the living room and sat down on the sofa, where the blanket he had slept under last night was still lying. He felt like an explorer treading thin ice, unsure where it would crack, but knowing he couldn't stop. His thoughts swirled around Sarah, her words, her behavior, and he began to remember other moments that had seemed insignificant before, but now formed an unsettling mosaic. A week ago, she had come home later than usual, her eyes shining and a small smile he hadn't seen in a long time. She had explained it as a meeting with a client, but her bag didn't smell like coffee, as she usually did after meetings at cafes, but something sweet, like vanilla or caramel, a smell that he associated with something foreign, not theirs. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now it seemed like evidence, a hint of another life that Sarah might be leading behind his back. His suspicions were growing like dark clouds before a storm, and he hated himself for it. He didn't want to be the kind of husband who watched his wife's every move, checked her phone, or interrogated her about every call. He loved Sarah, believed in their love, even after everything that had happened, but these little things, these hidden calls and deleted messages, were like sand caught in the mechanism of their relationship, small but capable of ruining everything if not removed. Henry remembered her confession about a friend, how this Matt reminded her of her dreams, and now he wondered, was this really just a friend? Or had Sarah, tired of his neglect, found someone to fill the void he had created? He stood up and went to the window, looking out onto the street where the street lamps had already come on, casting a soft light on the wet asphalt. His reflection in the glass looked tired, almost old, and he suddenly thought that maybe it wasn't just Sarah. Maybe he himself had become a shadow of the man she had fallen in love with. Henry, who had walked the streets with her at night, laughing at her jokes and dreaming of the future, had gotten lost somewhere in the endless workdays and the usual routine. He wanted to get that self back, but now, with these new suspicions, he felt like time was working against him. At that moment, he heard the front door open. Sarah was back, her hair slightly damp from the evening air, holding a paper bag from the bakery that smelled of freshly baked bread. She smiled at him, but it was a tight smile, as if she knew he had noticed her absences, her secrecy. Henry felt his heart tighten. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust her words, but something inside told him that the truth was hidden between the lines, in the little things he noticed more and more often. "You're early," she said, putting the bag on the table. "I thought you were still at work." "I finished early," he replied, trying to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him by a tremor. "Where did you go?" She froze for a split second, and the pause was like a bolt from the blue. "Just to the bakery," she replied, pointing to the bag. "I wanted something fresh for dinner." Henry nodded, but his gaze fell on her phone, which she immediately shoved into her pocket, as if she were afraid he would ask to see it. That gesture, so small but so meaningful, was the last straw. He didn't want to be paranoid, but he couldn't ignore the facts. The hidden calls, the deleted messages, the sudden absences, it all added up to a pattern he was afraid to acknowledge. "Sarah," he began, his voice firmer than he'd expected. "What's going on? I notice things. You leave, you don't say where. You hide your phone. I don't want to suspect you, but you're making me do it." Her eyes widened, and for a moment he thought she was going to cry, but instead she sat up straight, as if gathering her strength. "Henry, she paused, searching for words, and the pause was more painful than anything he'd experienced in days. "I'm not hiding anything you're thinking. But yes, there are things I'm not ready to talk about. Not yet." "Bye?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "What do you mean, bye?" "Sarah, we agreed to be honest. After everything that happened, after these letters, after your confession, are you still hiding something?" She looked away, and that was worse than any answer. Henry felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move could send him over the edge. He wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but instead he just looked at her, hoping that she would take a step toward him. "I don't want to lose you," she said finally, her voice so quiet he could barely hear her. "But I need to figure myself out. What I want, and I don't know how to explain this without you hating me." The words hit him like a hammer, but there was a sincerity in them that made him pause. He saw her struggle, her eyes filling with tears, and he knew she wasn't lying, she was truly confused, and her secrecy might not have been a betrayal, but an attempt to protect him, or herself, or both. But it didn't take away the pain, didn't take away the suspicion that was now taking root in his heart. "Then tell me," he said, stepping closer but not touching her, as if afraid that touch would ruin the moment. "Tell me what's going on. I don't want to guess, Sarah. I want to know." She nodded, but instead of answering, she simply hugged him, pressing him so tightly that he could feel her heart beating in unison with his. The hug was not an answer, but a promise that the truth hidden between the lines of her words and actions would soon come to light. But Henry knew that light could be blinding, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what he would see. They stood there, holding each other in silence, as the evening light faded, and Henry felt his suspicions warring with his love, creating a storm inside him that could either destroy everything or cleanse their relationship, like rain cleansing the air after a long heat. He decided he would not press, but he would watch, piece these little things together like a puzzle until the whole picture came together. The truth was there, somewhere between the lines of her words, in her eyes, in her sudden absences, and he was determined to find it, even if it broke his heart. The evening had fallen on their house like a heavy blanket, saturated with tension and foreboding that hung in the air like invisible sparks ready to burst into flame, and Henry was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into an empty tea mug, the sediment at the bottom reminding him of the sediment in their relationship that had accumulated over the years. But he had never thought it would be so bitter and inevitable, and opposite him was Sarah, her face pale and her hands shaking, clenched into fists, trying to gather her strength, because she knew that the words that were about to fall from her lips would change everything forever, would shatter their world into pieces that might never be put back together. And in that silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, she finally looked up, full of tears and determination, and said the words that Henry had subconsciously been afraid to hear all his life. Henry, I don't know how to say this, but I have to, because holding this in any longer is like carrying a weight around inside me that's getting heavier every day, and I'm afraid that if I don't say it now, I'll just break, I'll shatter into pieces, and then nothing will be able to fix it, she began, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind before a storm, and she paused, gulping air as if it were poison, but necessary in order to continue, and Henry felt his heart tighten because there was something final in her tone, like a sentence from which there was no appeal. "Sarah, what do you mean?" he asked, his own voice sounding muffled and distant because panic was already raging inside him, the same panic that was whispering the worst, that all his suspicions, all those secret calls and absences were not just paranoia, but a reality that was about to crash down on him like a wave washing away everything in its path. And he leaned forward, trying to catch her eye, but she looked away, looking at the floor, where the patterns on the carpet seemed to her like a labyrinth from which there was no way out. "Remember, I was talking about that friend, Matt," she continued, and her words fell slowly, each like a drop of rain on hot asphalt, hissing and evaporating in the air, leaving a trace of pain. "This is not just a friend, Henry. This is a romance, not a random one, not one episode that happened out of stupidity or despair, but a real story that has been going on for months, maybe even a year. I lost track of time, because in it I found what was missing in us, that warmth, that attention, that feeling that I am alive, and not just existing next to you in this routine that sucks you in like a swamp." Henry froze, his world suddenly narrowing to this kitchen, to her face, twisted in agony, and to those words echoing in his head, tearing everything apart, and he felt the ground slipping out from under his feet, as if he was standing on the edge of a cliff and was about to fall down into an abyss where there was nothing but pain and emptiness, and he opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat like a lump that he couldn't swallow, couldn't spit out, and instead he just asked, hoarsely, almost a whisper, How did this happen? Why, Sarah, why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let this drag on when we could have talked, made it right, stopped this from destroying everything we'd spent years building?" She sighed, and it was a sigh of regret, but also of relief, because the secret that had been burning inside her had finally come out, and she began to talk, her words pouring out like a river breaking through a dam, carrying with them the wreckage of their life together. "It all started innocently, Henry, in that cafe where I was working on designs, and he came up to me and asked about my work, and we started talking about art, about dreams, about how life sometimes goes in a direction we didn't plan, and there was something so alive, so sparkling about him that I felt young again, that Sarah who danced in the kitchen and dreamed of a bakery in Italy, and not this tired woman who waits for you to come home from work, and you come home exhausted and withdrawn, and we just say nothing, or we talk about bills, about the weather, about anything but what's really important, and one conversation led to another, then meetings, first just coffee, then walks, and suddenly I realized that this was more than friendship, that I was waiting for his messages, his calls, his touches, and I tried to stop, I swear, Henry, I tried, but every time I came home, to our silence, to your absence even when you were near, I reached out to him again, because he gave me air when I was suffocating. You, you slept with him?" Henry forced out, and the question hung in the air like a dagger ready to pierce his heart, and he didn't want to know the answer, but at the same time he had to, because not knowing was worse. It ate away at him from the inside like acid, and Sarah nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks, leaving wet tracks, and she whispered, "Yes, Henry, yes, and more than once it was. It became a part of my life, a part that I hid from you because I knew it would break you, break us. But I couldn't stop. It's like an addiction, like a drug that gives the illusion of happiness until it destroys everything around it." He leaned back in his chair, feeling the world spinning, like he was drunk. But it wasn't the alcohol. It was the reality that hit him in the gut, and he imagined them, Sarah and this Matt, hugging each other, laughing, loving, and the image burned him like fire, and he screamed, unable to contain himself, "How could you, Sarah? How could you betray me, us, our love that we built from nothing, from that first meeting in the cafe, from all these years when we fought together, rejoiced together, and now you say that you found someone else who is better, who gives you what I could not. But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me a chance to fix it? Instead of lying, hiding, going on your absences and deleting messages, making me go crazy with suspicion. I tried, Henry, believe me, I tried to talk to you, but you were always busy, always in your work, in your thoughts, and when I hinted, you brushed me off, said it was okay, that we could cope, but we couldn't cope, we were drowning, and I drowned in this affair because it was salvation, or seemed like it. But now I see that it was a mistake, a huge, irreparable one, and I don't know what to do, because I love you, despite everything, but I love him. Him too, in a way, and it's tearing me apart, she answered, her voice breaking into sobs, and she reached out, trying to touch him, but Henry pulled away as if from fire, because her touch now burned, reminding him of betrayal. Do you love me? He asked again, with a bitterness that filled him like poison flowing through his veins. If you love me, then why did you choose him? Why did you let it drag on, months, a year, Sarah, a year of lies? A year when I thought we were just in a crisis. But in reality, you were living a double life, with him in bed, with him in your thoughts. And I was a fool who believed in our love, in our future. And now what? Do you want me to forgive you? For us to continue as if nothing had happened? Or is this the end? Are you going to him, leaving me in ruins? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and she whispered, I don't know Henry. I don't know what I want, because with him I feel alive. But without you, I feel empty, like a part of me has been torn away, and I came to you with this confession because I can't lie anymore, I can't hide anymore, and maybe this is the end, maybe we'll break up, but I hope not, that we'll find a way to get through this, if you can forgive, if we both change, but I understand if you can't, because it hurts so much, and I don't forgive myself. Henry stood up, his legs shaking like he'd been running for a long time, and he paced the kitchen, trying to think, to gather his thoughts that were scattering like leaves in the wind. And he turned to her, his eyes full of tears that he was holding back with all his might, and he said, You ruined everything, Sarah. With one confession, you ruined our home, our life, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you without this pain, without pictures in my head of you with him. But a part of me still loves you no matter what. And that's the scariest thing, because love doesn't just go away, it hurts, it torments, and now we have to decide whether it's worth fighting for or whether it's better to let go. But right now, I feel like I'm losing ground, like I'm falling into an abyss, and there's nothing to hold on to. They were silent for a long time, tears flowing, words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that had just flared up. And in this silence, Henry realized that their conversation was not just destroying everything, it was revealing the truth, naked and cruel, and there was no escape from it. But maybe something new would be born from these ruins, or perhaps nothing, only emptiness and memories of what had once been their happiness. Henry sat back down, his hands shaking, and he asked, trying to keep his voice even, but it broke on every syllable. Tell me about him, Sarah. Tell me who he is, this Matt. What is it about him that I am not? Why he was able to win you over when I fought for us every day, even if I didn't show it, even if I was blind to your signals. But I loved you, I love you, and that hasn't changed despite your betrayal. She wiped her tears with her sleeve, and her voice became quieter but more honest. He is an artist, Henry, a free spirit who lives in the moment, does not think about tomorrow, but enjoys today, and with him I felt not just a wife, but a woman, desired, interesting. He listened to my stories, my dreams, and did not brush me off, like you sometimes do when you are tired from work. He took me by the hand and led me to galleries, to parks, to places where life is in full swing, and yes, we kissed, made love to each other in his studio, full of colors and chaos, and it was like an explosion, like fireworks. But now I see that it was an illusion, because true love is not only passion, but also the everyday life that we shared, and I regret, so regret, that I allowed this to happen. Do you regret it? He echoed, and there was a mixture of sarcasm and pain in his tone that cut like a knife. Do you regret it just because I found out, or because it's true, Sarah? Tell me honestly, if I hadn't noticed your absences, your messages, you would have kept on, wouldn't you? You would have kept on lying to my face, coming home and pretending that everything was fine, that we were a couple, when in reality you were dividing yourself into two. And it's unbearable, because I trusted you, blindly, completely, and now that trust is shattered like glass, and the shards dig into me every time I think about you. Yes, I would have continued, I suppose, she admitted, and it was like a blow, but an honest one, without embellishment. Because I'm a coward, Henry, I was afraid of losing you, afraid of the pain I would cause, but I couldn't give up the feeling of freedom it gave me. But now that it's all out in the open, I realize it was selfishness, pure selfishness, and I'm ready for the consequences, ready to leave if you tell me, or fight if you give me a chance. But the decision is yours, because it's my fault, I destroyed, and now you have the right to be angry, to hate, to everything. Henry closed his eyes, trying to collect himself, and whispered, I don't hate you, Sarah. I hate the situation. I hate myself for not noticing, for not being better, but I also hate you for the choices you made, and now we need to figure out what to do next, because we can't just live like this, with this lie between us, with this wound that's bleeding, and maybe we need a break, or therapy, or a divorce, I don't know. But right now I feel like the world has collapsed, and I'm in pieces, trying to get up, but my legs won't hold me up. They continued talking all night, the words flowing, the tears streaming, and each dialogue was like a step through a minefield, where explosions of pain alternated with moments of tenderness, memories of good things, and Henry screamed, then hugged her, and Sarah cried, then begged for forgiveness, and in this chaos of emotions they tried to find a way, but so far everything was collapsing like a house of cards in a gust of wind, leaving only questions and pain that, perhaps, would subside with time, but would never disappear completely. The silence in their house had become almost tangible, like a thick fog that enveloped everything, hiding the contours of familiar things, and Henry sat in the living room, clutching an empty mug in his hands, as if it could give him answers to the questions that tore at his soul like wild animals released from a cage, and across from him, Sarah, with her tear-stained eyes and trembling lips, was preparing to reveal another truth, another wound that he felt would be fatal to their marriage, because after her last confession about her affair with Matt, he thought that things couldn't get any worse, but her look, full of guilt and fear, said that he was wrong, and this mistake would cost him everything he considered his life. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor that seemed like ghosts of their past, and in that ghostly silence Sarah began to speak, her voice barely audible, like the whisper of the wind before a storm, but each word fell like a hammer on an anvil, shattering the remnants of hope that Henry still clung to like a drowning man to a straw. Henry, I have to tell you everything, she began, her fingers nervously fiddling with the hem of the sweater that had once been his favorite, but now seemed like a symbol of their breakup, because he saw in it not the comfort, but the lie she hid behind her usual tenderness, and she continued, her words trembling like leaves on an autumn tree, ready to fall off and fly away forever. It's not just Matt, there were others, not one person, but several, and I don't know how to explain it so you'll understand, so you won't hate me even more. But I have to be honest, because the lies have almost destroyed me already, and I don't want them to destroy you, too. Henry felt his heart stop, as if someone had turned off a light in his soul, and he stared at her, his eyes full of disbelief and pain and anger, all mixed into a bubbling cocktail ready to explode, and he asked hoarsely, his voice like the crack of breaking ice, "The others, Sarah, what do you mean, the others? How many were there? Who were they? And why the hell are you doing this to me, to us, to what we've built all these years, what I've worked for, what I've lived for?" She hung her head, tears dripping onto her knees, leaving dark stains on her jeans, and she spoke, her voice full of anguish but also determination, because she knew there was no turning back, and the truth, no matter how terrible it was, had to come out like pus from a wound to give it a chance to heal, even if that healing meant the end of their marriage. They were American sailors, Henry, the kind that come into the port nearby. I met them in the bar where I went sometimes to escape, to feel alive, because at home I felt like a ghost who just existed, cooking dinners, cleaning, waiting for you, and you came back tired, distant, and I don't blame you, really, but I was looking for something that would make me feel like a woman again, desired, free, and these meetings. They were like flashes, like moments when I could forget about the routine, about the pain, about that we were drifting apart, and I'm not proud of it. I hate myself for it. But then, in those moments, it was like a breath of air, like I was breathing again. Sailors, Henry said, his voice full of disbelief, and he stood up, pacing the room like a cornered animal, because the image of Sarah in the bar, with the strangers who came and went like ships in port, was more than just a betrayal to him, something that cut him to pieces, like a knife stabbing him in the heart over and over again, and he turned to her, his eyes blazing. But there was not only rage in them, but also desperation, like a man who sees his world crumbling and can do nothing about it. You mean it wasn't just talking to Matt, it wasn't just one affair, but you. You slept with strangers, with sailors you'd only seen once in your life, in a bar like you. Like you're not my wife, but someone else, someone I don't know. And that Sarah, that's not just cheating, that's bloody betrayal. That's like you took everything we had and threw it into the sea, so it would drown along with those moments of freedom of yours. Sarah looked up, and there was such pain in her eyes that for a moment Henry felt a pang of pity, but he suppressed it immediately because the anger was stronger. It was bubbling inside him like lava ready to burst out, and she answered, her voice trembling but firm, as if she accepted his accusations as a well-deserved punishment. Yes, Henry, that's exactly it. I met them, not just one, several, on different nights, in different months, and each time I told myself that this was the last time, that I would come back to you, to us. But then I found myself again in that bar, among the noise, the laughter, their stories about the sea, about distant lands, and it was like a drug, like an escape from our life, where I felt locked in a cage, and I'm not justifying myself. I know that it's terrible, that it's a betrayal. But then I didn't think about you, about us. I thought only about how to break out of this emptiness, and now I stand before you, naked in soul, and ask. I don't know what I ask, maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding, although I know that I don't deserve either one. How many were there, Sarah? He asked, his voice cold as steel, and he hated himself for asking the question, because the answer didn't matter, but it did, because each new fact was another nail in the coffin of their marriage, and he looked at her, waiting for her to evade, to lie, but she didn't look away, and her answer was like the crack of a whip. For Henry, in the last 2 years, not counting Matt, who was special, but the rest were fleeting encounters, nothing serious, just nights when I lost myself to find something to make me feel. 4, he repeated, and the word hung in the air like a sentence, and he felt his knees buckling as if someone had pulled the support out from under him, and he sat back down, covering his face with his hands, because the images he was conjuring up of Sarah in the arms of strangers, laughing, giving herself to them, were too much to bear. They burned him like acid, and he whispered, "Why didn't you leave, Sarah? If I was such a bad husband, if you were looking for freedom, why didn't you come to me? Tell me you were unhappy, that you wanted someone else, instead of ruining everything like this, in secret, with these American strangers who meant nothing to you, but to me they are now like a knife in the back." She stood up, went to him, but didn't dare touch him. Her hands hung in the air like birds that don't know where to fly, and she answered, her voice full of tears, "Because I love you, Henry, despite everything. I've always loved, and those meetings, they weren't about love. They were about running away, about numbing the pain. But every time I came home, I looked at you and thought that I wanted to stay, that I wanted to fix it, but I didn't know how, and the fear of losing you was stronger than my conscience, and I hid it. I lied because I thought I could bury it in the past. But now I see that it's impossible, and I stand here telling you everything because I can't carry this burden alone anymore." Love? He almost shouted the word, standing up and backing away from her as if she were on fire, because her words about love now sounded like a mockery, like salt in a wound, and he went on, his voice shaking with rage and pain. "You call this love, Sarah? Sleeping with sailors in a dockside bar, lying to my face, coming home and pretending everything was okay, kissing me, sleeping with me when they were all that was on your mind. That's not love, that's bloody betrayal. It's like you took everything we had and trampled on it. And now you're standing here telling me you love me. But how can I trust you after that? How can I look at you without seeing them, without imagining how you laughed with them, how you gave yourself to them when I was here, believing that we were just in a crisis that could be overcome. Sarah fell to her knees, her sobs echoing around the room, and she held out her hands as if begging for mercy. I know, Henry, I know it's unforgivable. I know I ruined everything, but I didn't mean for it to be this way. I didn't want to be the one to break your heart. I was just lost, and those sailors, they were like waves that come and go, leaving nothing but a salty taste. But you're my home, my anchor, and I don't want to lose you, even though I know I already have, and I'm willing to accept whatever you decide, to leave if you say so, or to stay and fight if you give me a chance, even though I don't deserve it. Henry looked at her, his heart torn between love and hate, between wanting to hold her and screaming for her to go away forever, and he felt his world crumbling, as if someone had set their house on fire, and all that was left were ashes and memories of what he used to be, and he asked, his voice barely audible, "How can I live with this, Sarah? How can I forget that my wife, the woman I loved more than life itself, gave herself to strangers in a bar, seeking in them the freedom I couldn't give? How can I look at you without seeing them, without feeling that every look you give me, every word you say, is a lie, hiding even more secrets?" She stood up, her face wet with tears, and she answered, her voice full of despair but also hope. "I don't know, Henry. I don't know how you can get through this, but I know that I want to try. I want to work on us, on myself. I want to be better if you let me, and maybe we'll never go back to how it was, but maybe we'll build something new if you can find the strength to forgive, or at least try. But I'll understand if you can't, if you say this is the end, because I hate myself for what I did." They stood facing each other, separated by an abyss of pain, and Henry felt his soul being torn apart because he still loved her, despite the betrayal, despite these American strangers who had become part of their history, like dark stains on the light fabric of their marriage, and he knew that the decision he would make would change everything. But at that moment he could not think, he could not speak, he just looked at her, trying to find in her eyes the Sarah he had fallen in love with, and he wondered if she was still there, or if everything they had had sunk in the sea of her betrayals like a ship wrecked on the rocks. The night went on, and they talked, shouted, cried. Their words were like waves crashing against the shore, sometimes destroying, sometimes washing away the pain, and Henry imagined how he would walk away, leaving her, or how they would start over, with a clean slate. But each option was full of pain, and he knew that this conversation, these confessions, were not just the end of a chapter, but perhaps the end of the whole book of their lives, and what would happen next depended on whether he would find the strength to forgive or choose to let go, giving her to the sea, which she so sought in her moments of freedom. The night dragged on endlessly, like a black ribbon unwinding in the void, where every hour seemed like an eternity, and the silence between Henry and Sarah was saturated with pain, which, like poison, slowly spread through their veins, poisoning everything that was left of their once bright love. And Henry sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands shaking like a man who had just survived an earthquake that destroyed his world, and opposite him, Sarah, with her tear-stained face and drooping shoulders, seemed like a shadow of the woman he had once met in a cafe, where her laughter was like music, and her eyes shone with the promise of eternal happiness. Now those eyes were clouded with tears, and her voice, when she tried to speak, sounded as if she was balancing on the edge of an abyss, and every word could become that last push that would send them both into the abyss from which there was no return. Sarah's confession of her infidelities with the American sailors, her moments of freedom, as she called them, still hung in the air like heavy smoke after a fire, and Henry felt his mind split, torn into pieces, where one half still loved her, clung to the memories of their happy days, and the other screamed with anger, humiliation, and despair, unable to accept that the woman he considered his destiny had become a stranger whose actions he could neither understand nor forgive. Henry stood up, his movements jerky, almost mechanical, as if his body were separate from a mind too busy to control it, and he paced the living room, his footsteps echoing dully on the wooden floor, reminding him of how empty their home had become, which had once been full of laughter and warmth and plans for the future. He paused at the window, looking out onto the dark street, where the street lamps cast a cold light on the wet pavement, and in that light he could see his face reflected, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, like a man who had not slept for years, and he thought that perhaps that was true, because he had spent the last few years sleeping, oblivious to their marriage slowly dying, while Sarah sought refuge in the arms of strangers. His fingers clenched into fists, and he felt anger, hot and uncontrollable, rising from deep within his chest like lava, ready to burst forth and burn away everything that was left. "How could you, Sarah?" His voice was low, almost a growl, and he turned to face her, his eyes blazing, but there was pain in them too, cutting through him like 1,000 knives all at once. "How could you stand here in our home, looking me in the eyes, kissing me, sleeping with me, knowing that you were with them, with these sailors, these strangers you didn't even really know? You talk about freedom, but this isn't freedom, this is betrayal. It's like you took everything we built, our dreams, our promises, our love, and dashed it against the rocks like the ship they abandoned in the harbor." Sarah flinched, her face paling even more, and she opened her mouth to answer, but the words were stuck, as if an invisible hand was squeezing her throat, and she just looked at him, her eyes full of tears that kept flowing, leaving wet tracks on her cheeks, and she finally whispered, her voice fragile, like glass, ready to crack from the slightest touch. "I know, Henry, I know that this is a betrayal, and I hate myself for it. I hate every minute when I let myself go to that bar, on those nights when I lost myself. But then I didn't think about you, about us. I thought only about how I could survive, how not to suffocate in this life where I felt invisible. And I'm not making excuses for myself. I'm not asking you to understand, I just want you to know that I still love you, even if you don't believe me, even if it sounds like a lie after everything I've done." "Love!" Henry almost shouted the word, his voice echoing off the walls, and he stepped towards her, his hands shaking as if he didn't know whether to hug her or push her away, and he continued, his words like bullets fired from a revolver he couldn't stop. "You call this love, Sarah? Sleeping with strangers in a bar on the waterfront, lying to me, coming home and pretending that everything was okay, that we were a couple, that we were together, when in reality you were sharing yourself with them, with these American strangers who were just an adventure for you and a knife in the heart for me. How can I believe in your love when you ruined everything we had, when you made a fool of me for thinking that we were just going through a crisis while you were looking for freedom in bed with others?" She stood up, her movements slow, almost painful, as if every word Henry said hit her like a physical blow, and she reached out, trying to touch him, but he retreated, and the gesture was like a wall growing between them, impenetrable and cold. "I don't know how to explain, Henry," she said, her voice shaking, but there was a sincerity in it that cut him even harder, because he wanted to hate her, wanted to see her as nothing but a traitor, but her pain was as real as his own, and that made it harder. Those nights, those meetings, they weren't about love. They were about escape, about feeling alive when I felt dead inside. And I know that's no excuse, that it's selfishness, pure and terrible. But I never stopped loving you, even in those moments when I was with them. I thought about you, about how I was destroying everything, but I couldn't stop, as if I was in some kind of nightmare where I was my own enemy." Henry closed his eyes, his mind a seething cauldron of anger, humiliation, and despair all mingling into one toxic brew, and he felt his consciousness split as if he had become two people. One who still loved Sarah, remembered her smile on their wedding day, her warm embrace on cold winter nights, her dreams of the bakery and travel, and one who looked at her and saw a strange woman whose actions he could not understand, whose motives were a dark forest full of shadows and dangers. He opened his eyes and looked at her, trying to find in her face the Sarah he knew. But all he saw was a reflection of his own pain, and he asked, his voice quieter but full of bitterness, "Who are you, Sarah? I look at you, and I do not know who is in front of me. The wife I loved, who promised to be with me through thick and thin, or someone else who sought freedom in the arms of strangers, who lied to me, who destroyed everything we had? How can I live with that? How can I look at you without imagining how you laughed with them, how you gave yourself to them when I was here, believing in us?" She stepped closer, her tears uncontrollably flowing, and she answered, her voice full of desperation but also pleading, "I'm still me, Henry. I'm the same Sarah who loved you, who loves you, but I'm lost. I've done terrible things, and I don't know how to fix it. But I want to try, if you'll give me a chance, if you can find the strength to not see me as just my mistakes, because I live with them every day, and they're choking me like the chains I've put on myself. A chance, he almost laughed, but it was a bitter, empty laugh that echoed in his chest like an empty house. You think I can just forget, Sarah? Forget that my wife was with others, not just one, but a whole damn fleet of sailors who came and went like the waves, and I was here, blind, thinking we were just going through hard times. It's not just a mistake, it's a humiliation. It's like you took my pride, my love, my faith in us, and trampled it in that bar, amid drunken conversations and strangers' hands. Sarah fell to her knees, her sobs tearing through the silence, and she held out her hands as if begging for forgiveness that she knew might never come. I know, Henry, I know it's humiliating, and I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking you to give me a chance to show that I can be better, that we can be better if we both try, if we go to a therapist, if we go away somewhere, start over. I'm ready for anything. Just don't tell me this is the end, because without you, I don't know who I am. Without you, I'm just a shadow looking for salvation in the wrong places. Henry looked at her, his heart torn between wanting to hold her, to comfort her, to make everything go back to the way it was, and wanting to leave, to slam the door and never look back, because the pain was too great, the humiliation too deep, and the love, still alive, was like a knife cutting him from the inside. He walked toward her but didn't touch her, his hands hanging in the air as if he were afraid the touch would burn him, and he said, his voice full of weariness, I don't know, Sarah. I don't know if I can forgive, if I can look at you without seeing them, without feeling like I was a fool to believe in a fairy tale while you lived another life. I need time, I need to go away to think, because right now I don't know who you are, and I don't know who I am. He turned and walked out of the room, his steps heavy as if he were carrying their broken world on his shoulders, and he could hear her sobbing behind him. But he didn't look back because he knew that if he did, his resolve would crumble like a house of cards. He stepped outside, where the night air was cold and sharp, and walked aimlessly, his thoughts swirling like leaves in the autumn wind, imagining how their lives might have been different if he had been more attentive, if he had noticed her loneliness, if he hadn't let the routine stifle their love. But all that was in the past now, and before him was only darkness, full of unanswered questions. Henry walked through the empty streets, his mind splitting further and further, one part screaming that he had to fight, that love was stronger than betrayal, that they could build something new if they both wanted to, and another part whispering that trust was broken like crystal, and even if they glued the pieces back together, the cracks would remain forever. He stopped by the river, looking at the dark water that reflected the stars, and thought that maybe their love was like that river, deep but full of currents that could carry them in different directions. He didn't know whether he would choose forgiveness or leaving, but he knew that this would be the hardest choice he would ever make, and no matter what he decided, the pain would stay with him forever, like a scar that would never heal completely. Henry walked along the embankment, the cold night air biting his cheeks, and the river, flowing lazily below, reflecting the stars, as if mocking his broken heart, which now seemed like shards of glass scattered across the asphalt of his life, and every step was painful, as if he were walking on those shards barefoot, and her words about the sailors, about Matt, about her freedom circled in his head like a flock of crows pecking at the last of his faith in their marriage. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet carried him towards the old pub on the corner where he often met Jake, his friend from his student days, the man who always had the words to pull him out of the darkness, and now Henry desperately needed someone who could be an anchor in this storm of emotions that threatened to drag him down to the bottom, where there was nothing but emptiness and anger mixed with love that, strangely enough, still smoldered in his chest despite the betrayal that he could neither understand nor accept. The rusty anchor was nearly empty at this late hour, the dim lamplight casting long shadows on the wooden walls covered with faded photographs of ships and old dock workers, and the smell of beer and chips mingled with the faint scent of the sea that wafted through the place despite the distance from the port. Henry pushed open the heavy door, and the ringing of the bell above the door seemed like a signal for a new chapter, where he might find answers, or at least some comfort to get him through the night. Jake sat in the corner at his usual table, a mug of ale in his hand, his dark hair tousled and his eyes, usually bright with amusement, were serious today, as if he already knew that Henry had come for more than just a chat. Jake was the kind of man whose bluntness could cut like a knife, but whose friendship was also a lifeline, reliable if not always gentle. "You look like you've been run over by a truck," Jake said, setting his mug down and nodding toward the chair across from him, his voice low and slightly husky, like a man who laughs a lot but listens when he needs to. "What's wrong, Henry? Sit down and tell me. And don't tell me it's just fatigue. I know you too well." Henry sank into a chair, his shoulders slumped as if an invisible weight were pressing down on them, and he ordered a whiskey, not because he wanted to get drunk, but because he needed something to dull the pain that was burning inside him like a hot coal, and he began to speak, his words pouring out slowly, as if each one were a heavy stone he was pulling out of his soul. "Sarah, she cheated on me, Jake. Not with one, with several. Sailors, some Americans from the port, and then this Matt, the artist she had an affair with, not just a casual affair, but something long-term, and she says it was her freedom, but for me it's a betrayal, like a knife in the back, and I don't know who she is now. I don't know how to live with it, how to look at her without imagining her with them." Jake whistled, his eyebrows raised, but he didn't interrupt. He just leaned closer, his eyes full of sympathy, but also something else that Henry couldn't quite make out yet, and he was silent, letting Henry talk until he had spilled it all, about Alice's letters, about her confession, about the sailors, about the pain that was tearing him apart, and when Henry had finished, his voice broke, and he fell silent, staring into his glass, where the whiskey reflected the lamplight like a tiny beacon in the dark sea of his thoughts. "Shit, Henry, it's hard," Jake said, rubbing his chin, his fingers sliding over the light stubble on his face, and there was a shadow in his eyes, like he knew more than he was letting on, and it made Henry wary, because Jake was always so forthright, but there was something cagey in his voice right now, like he was balancing on the edge, deciding whether to speak or not. "I don't know what to say, other than you don't deserve this. But, look, I don't want to pry into things that aren't my place, but maybe you should take a break, go somewhere and think about it. Because, man, this isn't just cheating. It's like she's been living another life while you've been living yours." Henry nodded, but his gaze lingered on Jake because something in his tone, the way he looked away when he talked about another life, ignited a spark of suspicion in him, and he asked, trying to keep his voice level even though everything inside was boiling, "Jake, you know something, don't you? You talk so weirdly, like you're holding something in. If you have something to say, say it, because I can't take these secrets anymore. This feeling that everyone around me knows more than I do." Jake sighed, his fingers tightening around his mug as he looked at Henry, his eyes filled with regret, but also determination, like he knew his words would come as another blow, but couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Okay, Henry, I didn't want to bring this up because it's none of my business, but since you ask, I saw Sarah at that bar, the Sea Wolf, a couple months ago. She wasn't alone, not with Matt, but with some guy in a military uniform, and well, they looked close, too close to just talk. I didn't go over, I didn't want to pry, but it didn't seem like a casual encounter, Henry." She was laughing, her eyes were shining, like she was in her own world, and I thought maybe it was a one-time thing, but now that you tell me, it seems like it was part of her freedom. Henry felt his heart skip a beat, and the world around him narrowed to this pub, to Jake's face, to his words that were like a hammer smashing through the last of his illusions, and he whispered, his voice shaking with anger and pain, "You saw her, and you didn't tell me? Jake, you're my friend. You knew she was my wife, and you just watched her flirt with some sailor, and you didn't do anything, didn't call me, didn't say a word. How could you keep quiet, knowing it was tearing my life apart?" Jake raised his hands defensively, his face tense, but he didn't look away. "I didn't know what to do, Henry. I didn't want to be the one to ruin your marriage. I didn't want to get involved until I was sure it wasn't just a fluke. I thought maybe she was just having a drink with a friend or something, but then I heard rumors at the bar, from the bartender, that she was a regular there, that she'd been seen with different guys, Not just that sailor, but others, and I. I didn't know how to tell you that because you were so happy with her. You believed in her so much, and I didn't want to be the one to break your heart. Rumors. Henry almost shouted the word, his voice echoing around the nearly empty pub and several heads turning in their direction. But he didn't care, because his world was crumbling and every word Jake said was another stone falling on the rubble. You mean the whole port knew that my wife, that she was out there with those sailors, those strangers, and I was the only fool who didn't suspect anything? Was everyone laughing behind my back while I thought we were just going through a crisis? No, Henry, it wasn't. Jake shook his head, his voice firm but regretful. No one was laughing. It wasn't gossip all over town. It was just a couple people at the bar who noticed that she was there a lot. And I didn't know how to tell you because I saw how much you loved her, and I thought maybe it was temporary, that she was just confused. But now that you told me, I realized there was more to it than I thought. And I'm sorry, man. I really am. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Henry leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking, and he felt his anger give way to humiliation, which was worse because it made him feel small, pathetic, as if he were the last person to know the truth about his own life. He imagined Sarah in that bar, amid the noise and the laughter, her hair flying, her eyes shining as they had in the days when she had been his alone. But now she shared that light with others, strangers who did not know her as he did, who did not love her as he did, but who were receiving from her what should have been his alone. And worst of all, he knew that she was not the victim of circumstance she pretended to be, not a lost soul seeking solace in solitude. She had chosen those encounters, returned to that bar again and again, knowing that each time she was betraying him, their marriage, their love. She's not a victim, Jake, he said finally, his voice quiet but full of bitterness that washed over him like poison. She told me it was an escape, that she felt trapped, but that's no excuse. She didn't just slip up, she lived this life, chose it, enjoyed it while I was home, believing that we could make it right. And now I find out it wasn't just Matt, it wasn't just the sailors, it was the rumors that went around the bar, and you, my best friend, knew and kept quiet. How can I trust anyone now if you haven't even told me the truth? Jake hung his head, his fingers gripping his mug so tightly his knuckles were white, and he answered, his voice thick with guilt, I screwed up, Henry. I should have told you, but I was afraid you'd hate me for it, or that it would ruin everything even more. I thought maybe she'd tell you, or that it would end, but I was wrong, and I'm willing to accept your anger because I deserve it. But please don't close yourself off. Don't let it break you, because you're stronger than this. Henry looked at him, two emotions warring in his chest, anger at Jake for his silence and gratitude that he was here now, trying to support her, even if his words only added to the pain. He finished his whiskey, feeling it burn in his throat, but bringing no relief, and said, his voice hoarse, as if he were speaking from deep within his soul, I don't know what to do, Jake. I love her, even after all this, even after her lies, her betrayals, her freedom, but I don't know who she is anymore. She's not a victim, she made a choice. And that choice is like a knife, she's stuck in me, and I don't know if I can pull it out without bleeding. Jake nodded, his eyes full of sympathy, and he said, give yourself time, Henry. Don't make decisions tonight, not tonight when everything hurts. Go away for a few days, think, talk to her again, or don't talk, but don't let this destroy you. You deserve the truth, but you also deserve peace, and maybe that will come if you can find the strength to forgive or to leave. But it's your choice, and I'll be here for you no matter what you decide. Henry nodded, but there was no clarity in his head, only chaos, where his love for Sarah was fighting with the pain of her betrayal, and Jake's new revelations added another layer to the wound, showing that Sarah was not just a confused woman, but a person who had deliberately chosen this double life, enjoying it while he remained in the dark. He stood up, throwing a few notes on the table, and walked out of the pub, the night air burning in his lungs, and went home, not knowing what he would say to Sarah, but knowing that this view from the outside, this conversation with Jake, had changed everything, made her betrayal even more real, even more cruel, and he knew that now he had to decide if he could live with this truth, or if it would be the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. The night outside was thick and impenetrable, like ink spilled across the sky, where the stars seemed like tiny holes through which the light of hope barely broke through, and Henry, back from the pub, stood in the doorway of their house, his heart a battlefield where anger, pain, and love fought without leaving a winner, and he looked at Sarah, sitting on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying, and her hands, clenched into fists, trembling, as if she was trying to hold on to the last of her dignity, which she herself had shattered with her confessions. The conversation with Jake still echoed in his head, the words about how Sarah wasn't just a random guest in a waterfront bar, but part of his landscape, part of a world where she sought the freedom she said she couldn't find at home, and those words, confirmed by someone else's gaze, made her betrayal even more tangible, like a knife that doesn't just cut, but leaves scars that will never heal. Henry felt his soul torn between the desire to scream, to demand answers, and the weariness that pulled him down like an anchor dragging a ship to the bottom. Sarah looked up at him in the doorway, and her face twisted with a new wave of pain, as if his presence reminded her of the weight of her guilt, and she stood, her movements slow, almost hesitant, as if she were afraid that any sudden movement would destroy the delicate balance that still held them together. "Henry," she whispered, her voice rough with the tears she had cried all night, and there was so much pain in that whisper that for a moment he felt a pang of pity, but then he suppressed it, because the anger was stronger. It burned within him like a fire that could not be extinguished. "Please let me explain. Let me tell you why this happened. Because I don't want you to think it was about you not being good enough. It was about me, about my weakness, about my loneliness that I could not overcome." He walked into the room, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying their entire shattered world on his shoulders, and sat down across from her, his gaze cold, but still holding a spark of love that refused to fade despite everything. And he said, his voice low, almost threatening, but full of pain, "Explain. Sarah, you've already explained everything: the sailors, Matt, your freedom, your nights at the bar where you weren't just a guest, but part of this world I knew nothing about. What else can you say? That it wasn't a betrayal, but something else. That I'm supposed to understand, forgive, accept that my wife sought solace from strangers because I wasn't good enough." She shook her head, her tears starting up again, leaving shiny tracks on her cheeks, and she took a step closer, her hands shaking, as if she wanted to touch him but didn't dare, afraid he'd push her away, and her voice was full of desperation, like a drowning person begging to be saved. "No, Henry, it wasn't because you weren't good enough. You were. You were always my home, my anchor. But I felt lost, like I was disappearing into this life where every day is the same, where I cook dinner, wait for you, and you come home tired, distant, and I don't blame you, I really do. I know you worked for us, for the future, but I felt invisible, like I wasn't a woman anymore, just part of a routine, and that bar, those people. They were like an exit, like a door to another world, where I could be someone else, someone alive, someone who wasn't afraid to dream." Henry looked at her, and every word she said was a blade that cut deeper because he heard the truth in them. But the truth didn't bring relief, it only made the pain worse, and he answered, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. "You talk about being alone, Sarah, but haven't I ever been alone? Haven't I ever come home dreaming of your smile, of the conversations we had, of the laughs we used to have together? I worked to give us the life we dreamed of, so you could open your own bakery, so we could travel, but you chose not to talk to me, not to fight for us, to run to the bar, to the sailors, to this Matt who you said was giving you freedom. That's not loneliness, that's a choice, and you chose to betray me, to betray us, and now you stand here crying and asking me to understand. But how can I understand when every action you take screams that I wasn't enough for you?" She fell onto the couch, her sobs tearing through the silence, and she covered her face with her hands as if trying to hide from his words, from the truth that was sharp as glass, and she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I know it was a choice, and I hate myself for it. I hate every night I went there, every minute I lied to you. But then I didn't see any other way out. I was trapped where every day was gray, and in that bar. It was loud, it was bright, there were people there who didn't know me, who didn't expect anything from me except a smile, and I could pretend that I wasn't Sarah, waiting for her husband to come home from work. but someone else, someone free, someone living in the moment, and it was like a drug, Henry. I couldn't stop even when I knew it was wrong. He stood up, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, and he felt the anger rising again, like a wave, ready to wash over him, and he almost shouted, his voice echoing in the room. A drug? You call this a drug, Sarah? You slept with them, these strangers, people you barely knew, and you expect me to see it as just weakness, just running away. This isn't weakness, this is betrayal. This is like you took everything we had, our vows, our dreams, our love, and threw it out to sea, to be washed away like trash. And I'm left here picking up the pieces, trying to figure out how to go on when my wife, the woman I loved more than life itself, turned out to be someone I don't know. Sarah looked up, her eyes full of tears but also determined, like she was gathering the last of her strength to continue, and she answered, her voice shaking but firm. I don't expect you to forgive me, Henry. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm not who I was on those nights. I was lost and broken and looking for myself in all the wrong places. But now I'm here in front of you and I want to make amends. I want to work on us, on myself. I want to be better if you'll give me a chance. If you can look at me and see not just my mistakes, but the Sarah who still loves you, who wants to come back to you, to our home, to our life. Henry looked at her, his heart torn between anger and love, between the desire to scream and the desire to hold her, because despite everything, he saw sincerity in her eyes. But that sincerity was mixed with a pain he couldn't ignore. He went to the window, looking out onto the dark street where the streetlights cast a cold light, and said, his voice quieter but full of weariness, redemption, Sarah. How will you redeem this? How will you restore the trust you broke? I look at you and I see the woman I loved, but I also see the woman who lied to me, who chose strangers over me, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that, if I'll be able to look at you without picturing you in that bar, with them, with their hands on you, with their laughter that should have been mine. She stood up, her movements slow, as if each step was an effort, and she walked toward him, her hand hovering in the air, hesitant to touch him, and she said, her voice full of pleading, I don't know how to rebuild trust, Henry, but I'm willing to try, willing to see a therapist, willing to be open, willing to show you that I can change, that I want to be the Sarah you loved, and I understand if you can't forgive, if you decide to leave. But I'm asking you to give me a chance, give us a chance, because I don't want to lose you, even though I know I might already have. Henry turned to her, his eyes full of tears that he was holding back with all his might, and he answered, his voice hoarse, as if he was speaking from the depths of his soul. I don't know, Sarah. I don't know if I can forgive, if I can live with this, because every word you say, every excuse you make cuts me deeper, and I want to believe you. I want to believe that you can change, but right now I only feel pain, only emptiness where our love used to be, and I need time to understand if we have a future, or if all we have left is ruins. They stood in silence, separated by the gulf of her guilt and his pain, and Henry felt his mind continue to split, as if he were two people, one who still loved her despite everything, and one who saw her only as a traitor, whose words of love now rang hollow. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that her attempts to explain, her tears and excuses, only cut deeper into his heart, like the knife she had stabbed herself, and he went into the bedroom, closing the door, leaving her in the living room, where her sobs were the only sound in the quiet of the night. Morning came slowly, as if time itself did not want to move forward, knowing that this day would be the turning point, the moment when Henry and Sarah's lives would either begin to rebuild from the ashes or finally fall into ruin, and Henry stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the street, where the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the gray clouds, painting the world in soft golden tones that seemed to him a mockery of the darkness that reigned in his soul. The night passed without sleep, its hours stretched out like an endless tape on which were recorded all their conversations, all of Sarah's confessions, all of her tears and excuses, which, like sharp needles, pierced his heart, leaving wounds that he did not know how to heal. Her words about the sailors, about Matt, about her freedom and loneliness still played in his head like a broken record stuck on one note, and he felt his mind split, torn between two paths. Break up their family, walk away, leave everything behind, or try to forgive, pick up the pieces of their love and build something new, even if it meant living with pain that he knew would never go away completely. Henry closed his eyes, and his thoughts raced like a river after a storm, carrying away everything that had seemed solid and permanent. He saw their past as if it were stills from an old film, the colors bright and the sounds alive. Their first meeting in a cafe where her laughter was like music, her eyes shining like stars, and he, young and hopeful, felt like he had found his destiny. Their wedding, where she looked like an angel in a simple white dress, and he stood before her and promised to love her forever, never imagining that forever would be so fragile. Their evenings in the kitchen, dancing to the radio, laughing over spilled wine and making plans for a bakery, for travel, for children who might never come now, because everything they had built had turned out to be a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of her betrayal. His mind raced like a caged animal, wondering how he hadn't noticed how she was slipping away from him, how their love, so strong at first glance, was beginning to show cracks that he ignored, immersed in his work, in his ambitions, in the illusion that everything was okay. He remembered her words about how she felt invisible, how the loneliness was suffocating her, and part of him wanted to scream that she could have told him, could have fought for them instead of seeking comfort in the arms of strangers, but another part, quieter, whispered that it was his fault too, that his absence, his coldness, his inattention were like the wind that fanned the flames of her despair until they became a conflagration that consumed everything. Henry opened his eyes and looked at Sarah, sleeping, curled up on the living room couch, her face calm but her brows slightly furrowed even in her sleep, as if she carried her guilt even in her dreams. He felt his love for her, still alive like embers under the ashes, struggling with the anger that was like a storm ready to sweep everything away. He imagined himself leaving, packing his suitcase, leaving a note and disappearing, starting a new life without her, without pain, without the memories of her betrayals. But the picture was empty, cold, like a winter night without stars, because without Sarah, even after everything, his life was losing color, becoming gray, like asphalt in the rain. How to forgive, he asked himself, his inner voice full of despair. How to forgive a woman who slept with others, who lied to me, who chose them instead of me, knowing that every step she took was a knife in my heart. How can I live knowing that she was in that bar, among the noise and laughter, giving herself to strangers while I was here, believing in our love? But then another voice, softer, whispered, "And how can I live without her? How can I wake up every morning knowing that she is no longer with me, that her smile, her warmth, her voice are all just memories now? She made a mistake, she betrayed me, but she is here, she cries, she asks for forgiveness, she wants to atone for her guilt. Can love be stronger than pain? Can it become a bridge across this chasm?" Henry remembered the conversation with Jake, his words about how Sarah wasn't a victim of circumstance, that she had chosen this path, returning to the bar again and again, enjoying her freedom. And that knowledge cut him like a razor because it showed that her betrayal wasn't just weakness, but a conscious choice she had been making for months, maybe years. But then he remembered her tears, her confession, her plea for forgiveness, and he thought that maybe her guilt was also her cage, the one she was trying to escape from, and if he left, he would leave her in that cage forever, just as he had left himself in a cage of pain and loneliness. He walked into the living room, his steps soft so as not to wake her, and sat down next to her, looking at her face, which even then seemed beautiful to him, despite everything that had happened. He imagined them going to the therapist, sitting across from each other, opening their souls like archaeologists digging for the truth beneath layers of lies and pain. He imagined them leaving together, maybe to that lake where they had been happy, or to the Italy she had dreamed of, and starting over, step by step, building a new foundation where trust would be fragile but possible. But then his mind painted another picture. Him leaving her, and she was alone, perhaps returning to that bar, still searching for herself in someone else's arms. And the thought was unbearable because, despite everything, he didn't want her to lose herself completely. Love or pain, he asked himself, his thoughts swirling like leaves in the autumn wind. Love is stronger, but is it strong enough to survive this? Am I strong enough to forgive, to live with these images in my head? with this knowledge that she was with others? Or is it better to leave, to free us both, to give her a chance to find her freedom without lies, and for myself a chance to start over, even if it means being alone? Henry remembered their first night after their wedding, lying in bed with her head on his chest, and her whispering about how she wanted to grow old with him, to see his gray hair, to hold his hand as they sat on the porch of their house, and that memory was like a ray of light in the darkness, reminding him why he had loved her, why he still loved her despite the pain he knew would be his companion for years to come. He thought about how forgiveness wasn't forgetting, it was choosing to live with the truth, to accept it like a scar that became a part of you, and he asked himself if he was ready to make that choice, if he was ready to fight for them, even if it meant fighting himself every day. He stood up, his heart beating like a drum, and walked over to Sarah, gently touching her shoulder. She opened her eyes, her gaze full of fear and hope, and she whispered, "Henry, have you decided?" He looked at her, his voice quiet but firm, as if he had finally found a foothold in this chaos. "I don't know, Sarah. I don't know if I can forgive, if I can live with this, but I know that I love you, and this love is the only thing that keeps me here. I don't want to destroy our family, but I can't pretend that everything is okay. We need time, we need help, maybe therapy, maybe distance, but I want to try, because without you my life is empty, and I'm not ready to accept it." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time there was a spark of relief in them, and she nodded, her hand squeezing his as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling. "I'll do anything, Henry, anything you say, to bring you back, to bring us back," she whispered, and there was such sincerity in her voice that he felt his anger, his pain, begin to dissolve, not disappearing, but becoming part of something greater, their love, which might yet survive. Henry didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment he made a choice not to destroy, but to fight, even if that fight was the hardest of his life. He sat down next to her, their hands intertwined, and they were silent, watching the dawn slowly flood the room with light, a promise that even after the darkest night, morning could come. Dawn was creeping slowly into their house, as if the sun itself did not dare to disturb the delicate balance that had been established between Henry and Sarah since his decision to stay, and the light, soft and golden, fell on the floor in long stripes that seemed to Henry like scars on the body of their lives, reminders of wounds that had not yet healed and perhaps never would completely heal. He sat at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of cold coffee, its bitter aroma mingling with the scent of morning dew that came through the half-open window, and looked at Sarah, who stood at the stove, her movements mechanical, almost silent, as if she were afraid to disturb the silence that had settled between them, like an uninvited guest who cannot be driven away, but whose presence suffocates like an invisible hand squeezing the throat. This silence was not the silence that precedes reconciliation, not the silence that brings peace after a storm. It was a new silence, heavy as lead and more terrible than any scandal, because in it there were no cries, no tears, no accusations, only emptiness, where the words they could have said died without being born, and every look, every gesture was saturated with pain, which became their constant companion. Henry felt his heart beating slowly, as if it were tired of the endless war between love and betrayal, and he looked at Sarah, trying to find in her face the woman he had loved so many years ago, the one whose smile had been a beacon in a stormy sea, but whose face was now a mask hiding a storm of emotion, and he did not know whether it was genuine remorse or fear that he would leave after all. His decision to stay, made in the heat of the night, when her tears and pleas had made a hole in his anger, now seemed less a choice than a postponement of the inevitable, because although he could not cross the threshold and leave her, he did not know how to live with her, how to share space, air, life with a woman whose betrayals with Matt, with the sailors, with those American strangers still stood between them like a wall of glass, transparent but impenetrable. He wanted to speak, he wanted to shout, he wanted to ask how they would move on, but the words stuck in his throat, and instead there was this new silence that was louder than any scandal, because it said that their love might have survived, but the trust, its foundation, was shattered, like a crystal vase falling on a stone floor. Sarah turned, holding the frying pan with the sizzling eggs, and her eyes met his for a moment. But then she looked away, as if she were afraid he would see too much in them, her guilt, her fear, her hope, like a weak shoot pushing through the soil of her remorse. She set the pan down on the table, her movements careful, almost ritualistic, as if she were trying to bring back some semblance of normality through these simple actions cooking, serving. But Henry saw her hands shaking, her lips trembling slightly, and he realized that she, too, was feeling this silence, this new reality, where every step they took was like walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. She sat down opposite him, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, and she finally decided to speak, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid that loud words would destroy the fragile truce. "Henry, I know that you decided to stay, and I'm grateful, really, but I feel like you're still so far away, like you're here but not with me, and I don't know how to fix it, how to make you look at me again like you used to." He looked up, and there was a mixture of pain and weariness in his eyes, like a man who had been through a war and survived, but had lost too much to enjoy victory. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse, like the words were scraping against his throat, trying to get out. "I stayed because I love you, because I couldn't leave, but that doesn't mean it's any easier. I look at you, and I see you, but I also see everything you've done those nights at the bar, those men, your free moments, as you called them, and it's like a shadow that follows you, follows us, and I don't know how to make it go away, how to live with it without losing myself." Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept them from falling, pressing her lips together as if trying to hold the emotion inside, and she answered, her voice shaking but determined, "I know, Henry, I know I can't erase the past, I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm willing to work on this, willing to see a therapist, willing to be open, willing to show you that I can be better, that I want to be the Sarah you loved, not the one who sought herself in someone else's arms. But I feel this silence between us, and it scares me more than your screams, because there's no life in it, no hope, only emptiness, and I don't know how to fill it." Henry nodded, but his eyes were empty, as if he were looking through her, at some point on the horizon where their past and future intersected, but could not connect. He felt this new silence envelop them, like a fog that hid everything, even their own hearts, and he thought how strange it was that the love that had once been their salvation was now their prison, where they were both prisoners, with no idea how to free themselves. He remembered their first trip to the lake, where they had lay on the grass looking at the stars, and she had told him of her dreams, of the bakery, of traveling, of a life of adventure, and he had promised her that they would do it together, but now those promises seemed empty to him, like echoes in an abandoned house, because she had sought out her adventures without him, in a bar, among strangers, and the thought still burned in him like a hot coal that he could not get out of his chest. "I don't know how to fill this silence, Sarah," he said finally, his voice quiet but heavy, as if each word weighed a ton. "I want to believe that we can start over, that we can build something new, but every time I close my eyes I see you there, in that bar, with them, and it's like a poison that's slowly killing me. I stayed because I can't imagine life without you, but I also don't know how to live with you when that shadow is still here, between us, in every look we share, in every silence." She reached out, her fingers brushing his, and this time he didn't pull away, but his hand was cold, as if the warmth of their old closeness was gone forever. "I'll do anything, Henry," she whispered, her voice pleading, but there was a hint of desperation in it, as if she knew that her words, no matter how sincere, couldn't break through this wall of silence. "I'll wait as long as it takes, I'll fight, I'll change. Just don't let this silence defeat us, because I don't want to lose you, even though I know I may already have." He looked at her, and there was a storm in his eyes, love, pain, anger, hope, all mixed into one whirlwind that he could not stop, and he thought that perhaps this silence was their new punishment, their purgatory, where they would have to go through fire to find each other again, or to understand that their paths had diverged forever. He imagined them going to a therapist, sitting in an office where someone else's voice was trying to untangle the knots of their pain, or how they went on a trip, trying to bring back the spark that once burned so brightly. But then he saw another picture. Them sitting at the same table in a year in two, and this silence was still there, like a ghost that would never go away, and this thought was more terrible than any scandal, because it said that their love might survive, but it would never be the same. Henry squeezed her hand, not because he wanted to comfort her, but because he needed something real, something to hold on to, and he said, his voice barely audible, "We'll try, Sarah. We'll go to a therapist, we'll talk, we'll try, but I can't promise that this silence will go away, that I'll be able to forget, that I'll be able to look at you without seeing the past. But I'm here, and that's all I can give you now." She nodded, her tears falling on the table, and they sat in this new silence, which was their new reality, where every word, every gesture was a test, and they knew that a long road lay ahead of them, full of pain, but perhaps also hope, if they found the strength to go through this silence, which was more terrible than any scandal, because there was nothing in it, no anger, no tears, only an emptiness that they had to fill, or be lost in it forever. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.